Chapter 6 of the Opal Serpent by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A noise in the night. Both Deborah and Sylvia were astonished that Aaron should be so indifferent about their long concealment. They had expected and dreaded a storm. Yet, when the secret was told, Mr. Norman appeared to take it as calmly as though he had known about the matter from the first. Indeed, he seemed perfectly indifferent, and when he raised Sylvia and made her sit beside him on the sofa, he reverted to the brooch. "I shall certainly see Mr. Beecot," he said in a dreamy way. "Charing Cross Hospital. Of course, I'll go tomorrow. I had intended to see about selling the furniture then, but I'll wait till the next day. I want the brooch first. Yes, yes," and he opened and shut his hand in a strangely restless manner. The girl and the servant looked at one another in a perplexed way, for it was odd Norman should take the secret wooing of his daughter so quietly. He had never evinced much interest in Sylvia, who had been left mainly to the rough attentions of Miss Junk, but sometimes he had mentioned that Sylvia would be an heiress and fit to marry a poor peer. The love of Paul Beecot overthrew this scheme, if the man intended to carry it out, yet he did not seem to mind. Sylvia, thinking entirely of Paul, was glad, and the tense expression of her face relaxed. But Deborah sniffed, which was always an intimation that she intended to unburden her mind on an unpleasant subject. "Well, sir," she said, folding her arms and scratching her elbows, "I do think as offspring ain't lumps of dirt to be trod on in this way. I ask," she flung out her hands towards Sylvia, "is she your own or is she not?" "She is my daughter," said Aaron, mildly. "Why do you ask?" "'Cause you don't take interest you should take in her marriage, which is made in heaven if ever marriage was." Norman raised his head like a war horse at the sound of a trumpet call. "Who talks of marriage?" he asked sharply. "Dear father," said Sylvia gently, "did you not hear? I love Paul and I want to marry him." Aaron stared at her. "He is not a good match for you," was his reply. "He is the man I loved," cried Sylvia, tapping with her pretty foot. "Love," said Norman, with a melancholy smile. "There is no such thing, child. Talk of hate, for that exists." He clenched his hands again. "Hate that is as cruel as the grave." "Well, I'm sure, sir, and what have hate's to do with my beauty there? Has the love existed do, for Bart's been talked into filling his heart with the same by me. I got it out of a Family Herald," explained Deborah incoherently, "where gentry throws themselves on their knees to ask hands in marriage. Bart was down on his hunkers every night for 2 weeks before he proposed proper, and I says I " "Will you hold your tongue?" interrupted Aaron angrily. "You gabble and gabble till you make my head ache. You confuse me." "I want to clear your head," retorted Miss Junk, "seeing you take no interest in my pretty's livings." Norman placed his fingers under Sylvia's chin and tipped it up so that he could gaze into her eyes. "Child, do you love him?" he asked gravely. "Oh, father," whispered Sylvia, and said no more. The expression of her eyes was enough for Aaron, and he turned away with a sigh. "You know nothing about him," he said at length. "Beggin' pardon, sir, for being a gabbler," said Deborah, witheringly, "but I know what he is, we do. Fine young gent with long descents and stone figgers in churches, as Bart knows. Beecot's his pa's name, as is fighting with Mr. Paul by reason of contrariness, and I living, him being as stout as stout." "Perhaps you will explain, Sylvia," said Aaron, turning impatiently from the handmaiden. "I should have explained before," said the girl, quietly and very distinctly. "I loved Paul from the moment I saw him enter the shop 6 months ago. He came again and again, and we often talked. He told me of his love, and I confessed mine. Deborah wanted to know who he was and if he was a good man. From what I learned of Paul's people, he seemed to be all that was good and generous and high minded and loving. Deborah sent Bart on holiday to Wargrove in Essex, where Paul's parents live, and Bart found that Paul had left home because he wanted to be an author. Paul is very popular in Wargrove, and everyone speaks well of him. So Deborah thought we might be engaged, and have you a word to say against it, sir?" demanded Deborah, bristling. "No," said Aaron, after a pause, "but you should have told me." "We should," admitted Sylvia, quickly, "but Paul and I feared lest you should say no." "My child," said the old man, gravely, "so long as you wed a kind and good man, I have nothing to say. Sylvia, I have worked hard these many years, and have made much money, which by will I have left to you. When I die you will be rich. He is poor." "Paul, yes, he is poor, but what of that?" "Many fathers think that an objection," went on Aaron, without noticing her remark, "but I do not. You shall marry Paul before I go to America." "Lor'!" cried Deborah, "whatever are you going there for, sir?" "That's my business," said Aaron, dryly, "but I go as soon as I can. I have sold the books, and the furniture of these rooms shall be disposed of before the end of the week. My gems I take to Amsterdam for sale, and I go abroad next week. When I return in a fortnight you can marry Mr. Beecot. He is a good young man. I quite approve of him." Deborah snorted. "Seems to me as though you were glad to get quit of my pretty," she murmured, but too low to be overheard. "Oh, father," cried Sylvia, putting her arms around Norman's neck, "how good you are. I do love him so." "I hope the love will continue," said her father, cynically, and removing the girl's arms, to the secret indignation of Deborah. "I shall call on Mr. Beecot to morrow and speak to him myself about the matter. If we come to an arrangement, for I have a condition to make before I give my entire consent, I shall allow you a certain sum to live on. Then I shall go to America, and when I die you will inherit all my money. When I die," he added, casting the usual look over his shoulders. "But I won't die for many a long day," he said, with a determined air. "At least I hope not." "You are healthy enough, father." "Yes, yes, but healthy people die in queer ways." Deborah intervened impatiently. "I'm glad you wish to make my Lily Queen happy, sir," she said, nodding, "but change your mind you may if Mr. Beecot don't fall in." "Fall in?" queried Aaron. "With this arrangements. What is they?" Aaron looked undecided, then spoke impulsively, walking towards the door as he did so. "Let Mr. Beecot give me that Opal Serpent," he said, "and he shall have Sylvia and enough to live on." "But father, it is lost," cried Sylvia in dismay. She spoke to empty air. Norman had hastily passed through the door and was descending the stairs quicker than usual. Sylvia, in her eagerness to explain, would have followed, but Deborah drew her back with rough gentleness. "Let him go, Lily Queen," she said. "Let sleeping dogs lie if you love me." "Deborah, what do you mean?" asked Sylvia, breathlessly. "I don't mean anything that have a meaning," said Miss Junk, enigmatically. "But your pa's willing to sell you for that dratted brooch, whatever he wants for it. And you're to be put against the brooch, my honey pot. Yes, I'm billing hard," and Deborah snorted in proof of the extremity of her rage. "Never mind, Debby. Father consented that I shall marry Paul, and will give us enough to live on. Then Paul will write great books, and his father will ask him home again. Oh, oh!" Sylvia danced round the room gaily. "How happy I am!" "And happy you shall be if I die for it," shouted Deborah, screwing up her face, for she was not altogether satisfied, "though mysteries I don't hold with are about. America, what's he going to America for, and with that brooch, and him locking us up every night to sleep in cellars? Police courts and Old Baileys," said Miss Junk, frowning. "I don't like it, Sunbeam, and when you're married to Mr. Beecot I'll be that happy as never was." Sylvia opened her grey eyes in wide surprise and a little alarm. "Oh, Debby, you don't think there's anything wrong with father?" Miss Junk privately thought that there was a good deal wrong, but she folded Sylvia in her stout arms and dismissed the question with a snort. "No, lovely, my own, there ain't. It's just my silly way of going on. Orange buds and brides the sun shines on is your fortunes, Miss Sylvia, though how I'm going to call you Mrs. Beecot beats me," and Deborah rubbed her nose. "I shall always be Sylvia to you." "Bless you, Lady Bird, but don't ask me to live with Mr. Beecot's frantic pa, else there'll be scratchings if he don't do proper what he should do and don't. So there." Deborah swung her arms like a windmill. "My mind's easy and dinner's waiting, for, love or no love, eat you must, to keep your insides clockwork." When Bart heard the joyful news he was glad, but expressed regret that Norman should go to America. He did not wish to lose his situation, and never thought the old man would take him to the States also. Deborah vowed that if Aaron did want to transport Bart, so she put it, she would object. Then she unfolded a scheme by which, with Bart's savings and her own, they could start a laundry. "And I knows a drying ground," said Deborah, while talking at supper to her proposed husband, "as is lovely and cheap. One of them suburbs on the line to Essex, where my pretty will live when her husband's frantic pa makes it up. Jubilee Town's the place, and Victoria Avenue's the street. The sweetest cottage at 20 pun a year as I ever set eyes on. And my sister as is married to a bricklayer is near to help with the family." "The family?" echoed Bart, looking scared. "In course they will come, though it's early to be thinking of names for 'em. I'll do the washing, Bart, and you'll take round the cart. So don't you think things will be otherwise." "I don't want 'em to," said Bart, affectionately. "I always loved you, Debby, darling." "Ah," said Miss Junk, luxuriously, "I've taught you to, in quite a genteel way. What a scrubby little brat you were, Bart." "Yes," said Mr. Tawsey, eating rapidly. "I saw myself to day." "In a looking glass?" "Lor', Debby, no. But there was a brat all rags and dirty face and sauce as I was when you saw me first. He comes into the shop as bold as brass and asks for a book. I says, 'What do you want with a book?' And he says, looking at the shelves so empty, 'I sees you selling off,' he says. So I jumped up to clip him over the head when he cut. Tray's his name, Debby, and he's the kid as talked to that cold gent Mr. Beecot brought along with him when he got smashed." "Tray, that's a dog's name," said Deborah. "Old dog Tray, and quite good enough for gutter snipes. As to Mr. Hay, don't ask me to say he's good, for that he ain't. What's he want talking with gutter trays?" "And what do gutter trays want with books?" asked Bart, "though to be sure 'twas impertinence maybe." Deborah nodded. "That it was, and what you'd have done when you was a scrubby thing. Don't bolt your food, but make every bit help you to health and long living. You won't have gormandizing when we got the laundry, I can tell you." Next day Aaron went off in the afternoon to Charing Cross Hospital, after holding a conversation with a broker who had agreed to buy the derelict furniture. The shop, being empty, was supposed to be closed, but from force of habit Bart took down the shutters and lurked disconsolately behind the bare counter. Several old customers who had not heard of the sale entered, and were disappointed when they learned that Aaron was leaving. Their lamentations made Bart quite low-spirited. However, he was polite to all. But his manners broke down when a Hindoo entered to sell bootlaces. "I ain't got nothing to sell and don't want to buy nohow," said Bart, violently. The man did not move, but stood impassively in the doorway like a bronze statue. He wore a dirty red turban carelessly wound round his small head, an unclean blouse which had once been white, circled by a yellow handkerchief of some coarse stuff, dark blue trousers and slippers with curled up toes on naked feet. His eyes were black and sparkling, and he had a well trimmed moustache which contrasted oddly with his shabby attire. "Hokar is poor. Hokar need money. he whined in a monotone, but with his eyes glancing restlessly round the shop. "Give, Hokar, give," and he held out the laces. "Don't want any, I tell you," shouted Bart, tartly. "I'll call a peeler if you don't get." "Ho, ho! Who stole the donkey?" cried a shrill voice at the door, and from behind the hawker was poked a tousled, curly head with a grinning face which sadly needed washing. "You leave this cove alone, won't you? He's a pal of mine, d'you see?" "You get along with your pal, then," cried Bert, indignantly. "If he don't understand King's English, you do, Tray." Tray darted into the middle of the shop and made a face at the indignant shopman by putting his fingers in his mouth to widen it and pulling down his eyes. Hokar never smiled, but showed no disposition to move. Bart, angered at this blocking up the doorway and by Tray's war dance, jumped the counter. He aimed a blow at the gutter snipe's head, but missed it and fell full length. The next moment Tray was dancing on his body with his tongue out derisively. Then Hokar gave a weird smile. "Kalee," he said to himself, "Kalee." How the scene would have ended it is impossible to say, but while Bart strove to rise and overturn Tray, Aaron walked in past the Indian. "What's this?" he asked sharply. Tray stopped his dancing on Bart's prostrate body and gave a shrill whistle by placing two dirty fingers in his mouth. Then he darted between Norman's legs and made off. Hokar stood staring at the bookseller, and after a pause pointed with his finger. "One eye," he said calmly. "No good." Aaron was about to inquire what he meant by this insult when the Indian walked to the counter and placed something thereon, after which he moved away, and his voice was heard dying away down the street. "Hokar is poor. Hokar need money. Hokar Christian." "What's this?" demanded Norman, again assisting Bart roughly to his feet. "Blessed if I know," replied Tawsey, staring. "They're mad, I think," and he related the incoming of the Indian and the street Arab. "As for that Tray," said he, growling, "I'll punch his blooming head when I meets him again. Dancing on me, eh? Always meddling, that brat, just as he was when Mr. Beecot was smashed." "You saw that accident?" asked his master, fixing his one eye on him. "Yes," said Bart slowly, "I did, but Deborah she told me to say nothing. Mr. Beecot was smashed, and his friend, the cold-eyed glass gent, pulled him from under the wheels of that there machine with Tray to help him, and between 'em they carried him to the pavement." "Humph," said Aaron, resting his chin on his hand and speaking more to himself than to his assistant. "So Tray was on the spot. Humph." Bart, having brushed himself, moved behind the counter and took up what Hokar had left. "Why, it's brown sugar," he exclaimed, touching it with his tongue. "Coarse brown sugar, a handful." He stretched out his palm, heaped with the sugar, to his master. "What do that foreign person mean by leaving dirt about?" "I don't know, nor do I care," snapped Aaron, who appeared to be out of temper. "Throw it away," which Bart did, after grumbling again at the impudence of the street hawker. Norman did not go upstairs, but descended to the cellar, where he busied himself in looking over the contents of the three safes. In these were many small boxes filled with gems of all kinds, cut and uncut, also articles of jewelry consisting of necklaces, bracelets, stars for the hair, brooches, and tiaras. The jewels glittered in the flaring gaslight. Aaron fondled them as though they were living things. "You beauties," he whispered to himself, with his one eye gloating over his hoard. "I'll sell you, though it goes to my heart to part with lovely things. But I must, I must. And then I'll go, not to America, oh dear no, but to the South Seas. They won't find me there. No, no. I'll be rich and happy and free. Sylvia can marry and live happy. But the serpent," he said in a harsh tone. "Oh, the Opal Serpent. The pawnbroker shop. Stowley. Yes, I know it. I know it. Stowley. They want it back, but they shan't. I'll buy it from Beecot, by giving him Sylvia. It's lost, lost." He looked over his shoulder as he spoke in a terrified whisper. "Perhaps they have it, and then he leaped up and flung the armful of baubles he held on to the table. "And then I must get away, away." He pulled out 3 or 4 coarse sacks of small size and filled these with the jewellery. Then he tied a cork around the neck of each sack and sealed it. Afterwards, with a sigh, he closed the safe and turned down the gas. He did not leave by the trap, which led through the shop, but opened and locked the back door of the cellar, ascending the steps, and went out into the street through the side passage. "If they come," he thought, as he walked into the gathering night, "they won't find these. No, no," and he hugged the bags closely. Sylvia, upstairs, waited anxiously for the return of her father from the hospital, as she both wanted to hear how her lover was progressing and what he had said about the permission to marry being given. But Aaron did not come to supper, as was his usual custom. Bart said, when inquiries were made, that the master had gone down into the cellar and was probably there. Meanwhile, according to his usual habit, he put up the shutters and departed. Sylvia and Deborah ate their frugal meal and retired to bed, the girl much disturbed at the absence of her father. Outside in the street the passers-by diminished in number, and as the night grew darker and the lamps were lighted, hardly a person remained in Gwynne Street. It was not a fashionable thoroughfare, and after nightfall few people came that way. By 11 o'clock there was not a soul about. Even the one policeman who usually perambulated the street was conspicuous by his absence. Sylvia, in her bed, had fallen into a troubled sleep, and was dreaming of Paul, but not happily. She seemed to see him in trouble. Then she woke suddenly, with all her senses alert, and sat up. Faintly she heard a wild cry, and then came the 12 strokes of the church bells announcing midnight. Breathlessly she waited, but the cry was not repeated. In the darkness she sat up, listening until the quarter chimed. Then the measured footsteps of a policeman were heard passing down the street and dying away. Sylvia was terrified. Why, she hardly knew. But she sprang from her bed and hurried into Deborah's room. "Wake up," she said. "There's something wrong." Deborah was awake in a moment and lighted the lamp. On hearing Sylvia's story, she went down the stairs, followed by the girl. The door at the bottom, strange to say, was not locked. Deborah opened this, and peering into the shop, gave a cry of alarm and horror. Lying on the floor was Aaron, bound hand and foot. End of chapter 6.